So we're just getting going with people coming in. There's quite a lot of people registered for this afternoon session, so we'll take a few minutes until everybody is on board and comfortable. And while we're waiting, I'll just go over a few of the logistical matters that I will return to later if you missed them or missed part of them. Just noting that after we've heard from our speakers this afternoon, there will be a time for questions. And if you move your cursor to the bottom of your screen, one of the small icons there is identified as Q&A. This is where we will ask you to please enter your questions. We're not using the chat function for questions. And as I said, for those who are just entering now who may have missed some of these instructions, I will repeat them as we move to the question time. So welcome everyone to this afternoon's town hall dealing with the important subject of anti-Asian racism. I'd now like to introduce Member of Parliament for Vancouver Quadra and Minister of Digital Government, Joyce Murray, to say a few words and to introduce our first speaker.
Well, thanks so much, Catherine. And thanks to everyone that's participating, because this is going to be a participative session and on a very important topic. And I know that everyone has lots of things that you could be doing on your Saturday afternoon. And so being with us on with this event tells me that anti or racism against our Chinese Canadian community is something you're concerned about and want to give your feedback and also learn more about. So thanks for being thoughtful about that. And so this is the second event that we've had on anti-racism, and you may have been at the MP Brunch Connections last summer when I had Dr. June Francis come and speak with us about anti-Black racism. This is a phenomena that unfortunately is not centered on one demographic, but recently it has been very centered on Asian Canadians, with a 700% increase in violent incidents against Asian Canadians, just at a time when we're all working to find our way past a terrible pandemic. It is really a tragedy that some are using this as a time to divide rather than bring the community together. So I am once again very grateful to be able to acknowledge that this event is happening on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Now, before I make my introduction, I'm going to take just a few minutes to share with you a few thoughts about the recent federal budget, simply because that has been occupying a lot of time and attention for some Canadians, but certainly people like myself who are very involved we're in the kitchen as the meal was being cooked, and not the chef, but certainly a participant. And so there's some things that I think are super important that's come out of this budget. And I'd like to take just a few minutes and name a few. So clearly we need to finish the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that is a key one. That is one of three key themes of this budget is to continue to invest in health measures and continue to support Canadians during this time when there are still big challenges for some segments of our community. So it's almost like a two-part challenge economically, where some sectors and businesses are faring well and finding new opportunities, and others are devastated economically. And so what we're doing here is we're investing, I suppose, in Canadians' health and safety, with continuing to push the vaccine rollout, which is now, I think, past 14 million doses delivered to Canada, and we'll be ramping up our Pfizer deliveries from 1 million a week to 2 million a week in the coming days. The health dollars in the budget are quite substantial. We continue to support the provinces and territories in all their parts of keeping people safe and vaccinating people. We've invested a lot also in the biomanufacturing and life sciences sector, so we can rebuild our domestic ability to be our own producers and manufacturers of vaccines should this continue, or should we need to do that any time in the future. And another matter of this budget that was very much a priority is to support a strong recovery, and one that has a very green focus as well as is equitable amongst all Canadians. A couple of words about that. Because there has been a big challenge for young people and students. The budget includes about 215,000 opportunities for youth to have work placements and training, 500,000 new training seats on top of those opportunities for youth. Dollars support for our very hard hit tourism and arts and culture sectors. And that's being done, by the way, through a brand new regional development agency for British Columbia. I mean, most of us have heard about ACOA in the Atlantic Canada provinces, which is a regional development agency that really is focused on local needs. And we've never had one in British Columbia, but this budget creates that and brings $500 million. We'll be getting twice per capita what we used to receive through the Western Development Agency. So that's going to be a really big deal, especially for the regional communities, but also will be great for Vancouver. So that's part of the plan to put Canada on track to increasing our job numbers by 1 million new jobs over the course of this year alone. I know have really seen a lot of widespread support for the early learning and childcare program. It's so great to actually see this kind of rock solid commitment, which is to, within, I think, a few years, bring the cost of childcare down to $10 a day from much higher rates. That's one of the things I heard the most of from Vancouverites when I was first elected as an MP, and as a mother of two families here in Vancouver. My son and my daughter, both their children have struggled to find childcare, and certainly affordable childcare. So this is a huge social program that is also an economic program that will be with us enduring into the future. Is our commitment. So it's being set up as a permanent program similar to the one in Quebec, which has really upped the level of participation in the economy by women who want to work but weren't able to without affordable childcare. So I think that is a big commitment. It was a choice that we made, that right now our social investment needed to also think about how to help build the economy. And so childcare, I think, was a great fit. And then lastly, I want to say that the green recovery and the fact that we have upped our commitment for 2030 to 40 to 45% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And this is not just a speculative or a pie in the sky objective. This is the target that we will be laying out the plans to achieve that. We already have a plan that has been calculated to be able to achieve 37% reduction. We're going to have to up our stringency, as Mark Jacquard talked to us about last summer, and we can and will do that. So we're at a huge turning point in our fight against climate change, and this budget is a big proof of that. So enough on the budget, and I hope you'll have a chance to find out more about the things that interest you by going on the website and checking the budget document. Now I want to also, now what I'd like to do is introduce our first speaker. We're fortunate to have three people with us today who bring very different perspectives on this subject of anti-Asian racism. And the primary speaker is Dr. Henry Yu, who is a Vancouver native, grew up here and on Vancouver Island. He has been a principal since 2011 of St. John's College in UBC's International Graduate Student College. He has joined the Department of History at UBC after teaching at UCLA for 10 years. So Professor Yu, Dr. Yu has a very impressive biography and working on historical discrimination against Chinese peoples. He's worked with the city on that level. He's a director of the Initiative for Student Teaching and Research in Chinese Canadian Studies. So a real thought leader with his writing, his teaching, and his academic work. So I'm delighted to ask Dr. Yu to share his thoughts with us. So thank you for being with us, Henry.
Thanks, Minister Marie. Thanks for that very generous intro, but also for organizing and holding this, I think, a difficult and necessary conversation. But perhaps one that's needed. So. Let me just start with a few FQ, frequently asked questions, FAQs that I'm sure some people have in their minds. After the Atlanta shootings, the Atlanta massacre, really, if you want to use the right term, there was a great outpouring, I think, of shock and grief, and I have a little piece of paper on my desk where after spectacular moments of anti-Asian violence, I actually just put a little one check mark on it every time I get a media request or a request to speak. So during those 2 weeks after the Atlanta shooting, I counted, I think, 15 requests, and as I go back in time, there's this sort of constant, phoning me and saying, "Can you explain? Can you tell us what causes this? Can you explain the history of anti-Asian racism?" And I end up basically repeating myself a lot. So I start with that to say that although there is been a lot of shock tied to these incredibly difficult to watching elders in their 80s being shoved, punched, the 700% reported increase. Probably an undercount, in fact, of the numbers of anti-Asian assaults, both verbal and physical. But it's part of a longer history. One of the things I get asked is, are you surprised by this? And the answer, unfortunately, is I'm never surprised by spectacular moments that bring it to the consciousness, you could say, of a broader public, including many Asian Canadians, many Chinese, and other people of Asian background, or identifiable as Asian, or mistaken as Asian. I think of the story of Dakota Holmes, an Indigenous woman who someone mistook for Chinese, and was it really a mistake? And I think the first thing I want to lay out is that racism is not a mistake. So if I'm trying to beat up someone who I think is Chinese, and I end up beating up someone Korean or someone who's Indigenous, it's not like, oh, racists are so stupid that they can't tell the difference. The difference doesn't matter. And that's the first thing to understand about the history of racism, is that it's part of the founding of British Columbia that white supremacy became the way in which resources were allocated. Resources and privileges and rights such as voting, being able to choose who you would be governed by, land where you could live, jobs that you could have. And different forms of racism or different forms of white supremacy were built into the history of the country. And so for Indigenous peoples, you were moved off your territory. So we acknowledge, for instance, I'm here at UBC campus in Vancouver, and so we're on unceded traditional territory of Musqueam. That's because Indigenous peoples were moved off, you could say, the best real estate onto reserves, where they could not participate in the speculative real estate economy that was built to make money from taking land away. The particular racisms against Indigenous people were founded and formed around the idea that you will have nothing and then we'll blame you for the fact that you have nothing and you're having trouble. If you're struggling, it must be because you're inferior or your culture is not good or this or your leadership's bad or your corrupt government. That is a particular form of racism that has been devastating to Indigenous people. Anti-Asian racism is within that suite of ways in which non-whites within British Columbia were treated differently. And the first forms were anti-Chinese, and partly because there were many Chinese migrants who came here across the ocean who could get here much easier actually by water before helping build a railroad, the CPR, that brought people from the Atlantic coast here easily. And so if you think of that as a long history, what is the particular forms of anti-Asian racism? I'll sort of put this sort of more really generally. One is scapegoating for problems. And so if there are issues that are social issues, unaffordable housing in a speculative real estate economy that's been geared to, for instance, make money from housing as a speculative object, well then, if you have problems with blame Chinese, blame Asians. You saw that in 2014, 2015, 2016. You saw it in the 1980s and 1990s with the idea that Hong Kong Chinese were causing unaffordable housing. Housing has been, expensive because throughout the whole history of, say, Vancouver and Lower Mainland, it is an industry that's meant to make money. So if it's not affordable for many people, it's designed to be that way in many ways. I raise all this as a way of saying, why is it that in this spectacular moment, we are seeing violence against Asians or people mistaken as Chinese? Again, I put quote marks around mistakes. So, to answer the question, is COVID causing anti-Chinese racism? No. COVID is causing incredible difficulties for all of us, for everyone around the world. The idea that the Chinese may somehow be blamed, that has a long history. And that history of scapegoating I would actually liken to the way in which anti-Semitism operates. That if there are tensions, if there are things going on, and if you want to deflect attention away from perhaps complicated causes or, away from the fact that you can't do anything about it, then scapegoating, choosing a set of people to say that it's their fault. And that has a long history, and that is the nature of anti-Asian racism in BC. And that's why it is tied to a long history. That's why it's not an accident or a mistake that over the last year, as the devastation of COVID has hit so many communities, why in British Columbia and in certain parts across Canada and Ontario as well, that blaming Chinese or blaming Asians has become in many ways, a reaction for people. So I'll sort of stop there and pass it on, seeing that this is just an opening of a conversation. I think it's important to understand, in other words, anti-Asian racism as having long historical roots, but not caused by history. The legacy, in fact, is a legacy that we still have, which is an idea of who belongs, who deserves things here, and who doesn't. And this is a little bit tied to this idea of Asians as a model minority. So they're doing so well, Asians are rich and they're too rich, or if you see someone making money, it's not as deserved. So in a speculative real estate market, there's lots of people who are making money. But why do we not think it's appropriate that certain people make money, while others, we don't blink an eye? Other people, we go, yeah, if you bought a home in 1972 and it was $18,000, 20 years later, just by making your mortgage payments, you'd have equity of 1.5 to 2 million if you were inside anywhere inside East Van or South Van. If you were on the west side, it'd even be more. Lots of people made that money. Who do we feel appropriately made that money and passed it on to their kids as parts of the down payments for their kids? And who is it inappropriate to, or when is it inappropriate that some people make money? The other, so that idea, and I'll talk a little bit, I know that some of the people here are themselves highly educated, have really invested in success. And I think there's a lot of people who are hurting out there who are themselves Asian Canadian. And I just want to make a last remark about, you may be feeling like shock, depression. There's been mental health issues, I know, among many students here at UBC, among many professionals who are themselves Chinese or Korean, heritage, Asian Canadian, various sorts. Because it seems like these incredible investments in success that you've made, sacrifices for some people, parents who gave up, so much to bring, kids here, and that there seems to be an incredibly deep impact at this moment, facing what they see as racism, and being in shock. And I just want to acknowledge that, and I want to acknowledge that it's not your fault for your success, so to speak. The shock often is because of an idea that will protect you, that your investment in success and your investment in a possessive belonging in Canada, that we have won the right to be able to be successful, that somehow that's fallen short. And that sense of a gap is often very painful to people. And I raise that for some of you who perhaps are interested in this conversation because of a sense of a loss of but I've worked so hard. How come I'm still just as likely or unlikely to be shoved or punched for no reason at all? And that can be a very devastating feeling. And so I just want to acknowledge that as one of the dominant forms of what you don't have to be punched. Just knowing that has had an incredible effect in many communities across Canada. So I'll stop there and look forward, unfortunately, to a difficult conversation that is perhaps necessary.
Well, thank you for laying out that framework for thinking about this, Dr. Yu, and your historical perspective on this. We're focused on the Asian Canadian racism, but you've appropriately woven in the discrimination against Indigenous peoples and also the Jewish community. And unfortunately, I'm going to add that we're starting to see hints that there may be some waves of anti-South Asian or people who come from India and Pakistan emerging, and I hope not. I hope that conversations like this can head that off at the pass so that we don't have yet another community seeing a wave of destructive behaviors. So now I'm going to ask Ying Zhou to say some words. Now, Ying has lived in Canada since 2009 with her two daughters. She's a chemical engineering graduate and worked for more than a decade as a financial advisor in major financial institutions, first in China and then in Canada. Ying was elected to the University Neighborhood Association Board in 2013 and served as its chair from 2017 to 2019, and did an enormous amount of work to reach across the many communities that live in the UNA area and bring them together for cultural and other kinds of events to really help gel the community that was just emerging in UBC at the time she started living there. So Ying, currently I have the good fortune of having her work as a constituency assistant in my office. She was recognized as a Vancouver Quadra Hidden Hero in 2019. and recently qualified as an instructor of her favorite pastime and sport, which is skiing. So congratulations, Ying, on that, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Murray, for organizing such an important event at this challenging time, and for your very kind introduction. This is the worst moment for me since I immigrated to Canada 12 years ago. It has been heartbreaking to listen to so many sad stories from the Asian community again and again. One of my friends told me Asian Canadian women like myself face an even greater risk of attack, regardless of whether we are newcomers or fifth-generation Canadians. Our sense of security has been shattered. So many of my friends have warned their children to avoid strangers, even those children who were born in Canada. Do you know that a rally against anti-Asian racism drew thousands in Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto on March 28th? This support was encouraging. Do you know that the United States Senate passed a bill on April 22nd, 2 days ago, to combat the rise of the hate crimes against Asians during the pandemic? It has set the stage for the enactment of major new anti-hate crime law. I think one solution to eliminate racism is to gather people together from different backgrounds who have common interests and hobbies. We should also encourage our youth, our next generation, to take leadership roles in helping to build harmonious relationships. I have lived in a quite happy and safe community in the UBC neighborhood for over a decade. University Town, like a small municipality, has around 50%, one-half Asian residents. I would like to share some good examples on how to build bridges to create a respectful community. For many years, we have organized some popular programs to connect newcomers with local seniors, cooking workshops to exchange cultures through special foods. One of the most rewarding activities is engaging our youth to take active roles in closing the cultural gap. Our office held an Asian Heritage event last year with over 100 people from the Asian community, including high school students. We were very impressed to hear stories of their volunteer efforts to help people cope with the pandemic. It is one of many ways for the Asian community members to be recognized for their contributions and values. I'm hopeful in the near future, the Asian community will continue to stand up and speak out. I see the hope in the budget, as Minister Murray mentioned, that the government will allocate more resources to build a healthier, more inclusive, and more equal Canada for everyone. I hope you will pass this message out to your friends and neighbors. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ying, for your real life, sharing your real life experience on this. And I know that the UNA is remarkable for how people have reached out in so many ways to bridge the different cultures and just be a strong, solid community. I had to think while you were talking, it made me realize that for anyone who has a friend that is from the Asian Canadian community, how could one possibly take out angst against that community? So we just need more friendships across cultures, and that's exactly what you've been doing in your time in Canada. So thank you. Now we have also Noah Farage is a program coordinator, and Noah, you can correct my pronunciation of your last name if you'd like. Program coordinator with Hillel BC. So Noah works at Hillel House on the UBC campus. Hillel BC promotes and supports Jewish life on BC university and college campuses, and provides a way for students between the ages of 18 and 30 to celebrate Jewish holidays, be involved in social action and other projects, and engage in discussion about Jewish issues and Israel affairs. And I think, as we're all probably aware, that sadly there has been on university campuses is a space where some who are championing others' rights in the Middle East area have really veered into what is experienced to be anti-Semitism, and it's tough for the students. And so, Noah, you have firsthand experience in supporting people who face discrimination on a regular basis as well. So thanks for being with us today to share your perspective.
No problem. Thank you for having me. Thank you for a great intro. You did a great job of summarizing kind of what we do on campus, and one of the roles that we play is to be a support for students who often are a long way from home and who are young and haven't had an opportunity to really be by themselves and create their own communities on campus. So we our slogan is home away from home. So we talk about wanting to be that space where students can come and feel safe and ask challenging questions and have conversations, much like this one, about things that challenge them or experiences that they have, and to create that space for them to feel comfortable. So much like what Dr. Yu was saying about how, you know, the last year or year and a half, things have really kind of changed, especially when everything is online, and has kind of changed the game of what people are willing to say and willing to do, and how screens have changed people's ability to be anonymous. And we often find that many experiences of students are from strangers, that there are people who you can put any name on the internet and be any person you want to be. And it creates a really hard barrier for people to confront that when you don't have any way of knowing if somebody is a real person, or if this is somebody's real name, or any real interaction with them. So there's quite a few of the experiences that we've had with students on campus this year. And most of them have been resolved, but there's definitely question marks of how can we continue to support students, both in the Jewish world and allies and friends of the Jewish world, who we also warmly welcome into our space in our building, to have those conversations and to resolve those issues. And on the other end of that, we also see on a grand scale, much like, again, what Dr. Yu and Ying were saying, that in a grand scale across the country, across the continent, across the world, there is a huge increase in occasions and words, and most of those are not documented. Most of those are very subtle, very easy things to pass by on the street that you don't even know are happening to people. And really, in the Jewish case, it's about ultra-Orthodox people who are mostly targeted. I'm sure that people have seen, there's a specific sect in Williamsburg, New York, that is a very ultra-Orthodox community that is very community-centered. And they have also been blamed and conspired against that this is a creation of theirs, and they are responsible for spreading such things, and have really been targeted in the same kind of vein that Chinese and Asian people have been targeted in this specific context. So it's a similar challenge, of course different, but similar. And we are hoping that these conversations and conversations with young people on campuses and across the communities across the world can change people's views of what really is going on in the ground, and to provide answers for people, or spaces for them to come ask the questions that they can't ask other places. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be one of those people who can answer your questions, hopefully, and continue to have those conversations anytime.
So, thank you very
Yeah, no, great. Over to you, Catherine, for the Q&A.
Thank you, Joyce. Yes, thank you, everyone. We are about to start our Q&A, and just as we do, I'll remind you that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box rather than in the chat box. And as a few of them have already appeared, let me get started with the first questions. So this is a question from, I think it's a teacher who has some high school students, and the question is, what's the message to Asian high school students in particular about how to respond to anti-Asian racism from their peers, or from teachers even, or anyone else? Is there a special message for students?
I have 4 kids. They're all K through 12. My eldest is graduating this year, and so I'll say the first thing is, right now, to me, one of the structural issues that will last beyond, even if there is a drop in the number of incidents being reported and things, even if there's a structural issue, which is that much of our education system, K through 12, as well as higher education, the kinds of support services, counseling, who you can turn to if something happens, training and competencies that we at a place like UBC and SFU and other higher education places that teach teachers, we aren't doing a good enough job, frankly, of creating a structure where people know how to respond. And Noah was talking about having a place like Hillel, so that if there's a student who experiences anti-Semitism, that there's a place that a safe space they can go to and say, hey, this happened, and just in that shock of perhaps experiencing it, who do you turn to? I've heard too many stories of actually high school students and even younger. Something happens and they don't feel comfortable going to, or they go and perhaps there wasn't an ideal response, or they feel that it'll cause more trouble to report. And this goes to the thing about underreporting. When we ask, why is there underreporting? Why is it that people don't feel? The parallel to, for instance, I think a long history of sexual assault, underreporting is often as much a product of whether the person who has suffered an attack or an assault knows where to go, feels comfortable going there, and has not heard stories of, oh, if you go, they won't believe you, or they will respond inappropriately in some way. And so I think I would raise that as, if there's a message to high schools, I think the message is, of course, you've had something happen that's terrible, but if you don't feel like there are adequate support services, or if you are reticent to go because you look at the staff and you don't see any faces that look like yours, or that has a lot to do with how our professions and particular sectors, and I would point out education as well as arts and culture, they have not changed over the last 50 years as much as other industrial sectors. So if you look at engineering, the diversification of engineering and certain of sciences, of medicine, real estate industry. Why is it that if you look at actually some of the sectors that should be the most progressive, education, both higher education and K through 12 level, and not just teachers, I'm saying across the board in terms of administration, counseling, their, you know, student support services on campus at UBC. We are taking a hard look at UBC, at our structures. Is there student support services? We have an incredibly diverse population of students. Is it adequate in terms of appropriate, you know, and well-trained and people with the competencies to handle, you know, racism, to handle something happening? Do we have the people in place who, again, students feel comfortable going to? And so that's the thing I would raise as something that hopefully in this moment of heightened awareness, there are some inadequacies that are structural, and I think we need to deal with them because right now they're being highlighted. I think there are gaps and shortcomings and needs with that. I think we've done a great job with, for instance, bystander training, K through 12. But there's also an assumption with bystander training that it's happening to someone else, you know, someone else is being bullied. How are we actually adequately handling people who are actually suffering and being victimized, and understanding what might be going through their minds and having adequate addressing of that? So I know that's not a happy answer, but I think it also lays out that we have some real structural deficits that are historical in legacy, that in many ways different industries have not changed enough in response to the demographic changes that have happened in Canada.
So let me just related to that in terms of structural deficits, perhaps, and still on the education theme. One of our questioners has noted that education is a catalyst for change. And are you aware, or anyone else aware of any things underway to perhaps include more Asian American, Asian Canadian history in formal education, in our studies?
So let me be really categorically clear. I've been working 17 years in, you know, curriculum and creating a lot of curriculum resources. It's not that mention of Chinese or mention of non-whites is missing in the curriculum. It's one of the problems we're having right now is, if I say, have you heard of the head tax? Most people have. It is being taught that there was head tax. It's where does that mention? What is it within a larger story? What does it mean? Generally right now, when you're being taught about racism, the idea is that this was in the past, that we used to have racism and then now it's gone. Or you don't have to say now it's gone. You put it in the past. You know, say, oh, we used to have this head tax, we used to have exclusion, we used to do this, we used to do that. And in a strange way, that story of we used to, right, but implies that we don't anymore. And I think that is one of the actual difficulties right now of how we're actually teaching about racism. I'll give you an example. In British Columbia, there was a number of provincial laws that were passed in the 1960s that made it no longer legal to not exclude someone from housing or not hire someone in a job because of race as well as religion. Now, there's two consequences that we can think of that. One is, for 100 years in Canada, it was legal to discriminate by race. You could do it, and not only was it no problem, the state often was empowering that. The city of Vancouver had things that said, we will not contract with you if you have Chinese employees or if you contract with Chinese. There were laws, there were areas where if you were non-white, there were housing covenants, legally enforceable in titles that said no Jews, no Chinese, no blacks. Those were legal. The full power of the state was behind white supremacy. Now, when those laws were overturned, you could say, in the 1960s, one of the things I always ask is, how many people were fined? How many cases of enforcement? Actually, who was responsible for the enforcement of these new laws? When I asked that, I know the answer. There weren't. It's as if we magically said, by changing the laws, we removed racism, it ended. That for me, as a historian, and I'll put that out to think about, and as part of content of education, right? The idea that we are no longer racist, that we used to be, but it's gone, that is a magical alchemy, a kind of delusional trick that has created more difficulty, you could say, because then we don't see it in the present, or we're shocked, or we're surprised. If you feel shocked when you see racism, if you feel surprised, that is a direct result of the success of a racial erasure, we would call it, erasing that from our history so that we don't think it should be around. And therefore, we don't look how to make changes. That structural deficits. Why is it leadership positions that at UBC, I'll give you an example again at UBC, not that I think UBC is particularly bad, but at UBC, we have a very diverse lower staff, it draws from the local population. Every step you go up in terms of promotion, you lose non-whites. Until now, we now have Santa Ono, our president. We have a Japanese Canadian, so we're really but check the top 25 leadership positions. We have one other person of color. And so 2 out of 25. It's been like that for 40 years. We haven't, the most we've ever had in our leadership is 2 non-whites out of 25. So we don't even see it. And so I want to raise that as content is one thing. To say that we were racist in the beginning, but what is the lesson for our students that we are actually aiming to teach as teachers, as an education system?
Thank you. That's a good point. We're getting more questions now, so hope we'll be able to get to lots of them. This next question is for Noah. Noah, what do you think about social media and our own echo chambers contributing to racism?
I think that social media is a double-edged sword, and that it is incredibly important for education and for access and for widespread of facts and actual stories, and to be able to connect human to human. But I also think that it, in the wrong way or in the wrong hands, leads to, again, the ability to hide, the ability to put anything out on the internet and people think that it's fact, and not to have to fact check things, and to make sure that what you're reading and what you're then sharing in your network is true and is based on somebody's experience or actual events that have happened in the world. For me personally, and in my line of work, it's incredibly important, especially right now when many of our students are all over the world. Many people did not have the opportunity to come back this year, this semester, and to be able to share with them what we're doing, and that we're still here and we're still supporting you, and it's all virtual, but it's still very real and very here, is priceless. But it has to be used in the right way.
Right, good point. Thank you. Yingzhou, perhaps could you give a little bit more examples of real life events where you've seen people coming together and stopping racism?
Thank you for the question. Before COVID, in our community, we have organized so many events. As I mentioned, the most popular event is for seniors and the newcomers together. It's a way to share experience and to understand each other. And another example is for the cook workshop. We've been there for every month before COVID for several years. So from sometimes we have hundreds of people from 10 different countries to share one specific food. That is really a good way for people to gather together to share the culture and to know each other. Normally, if people come together, know each other, when they go to the community, when they meet each other, no gap, definitely no gap after that.
Thank you. Thank you. We've had a few questions about conflicts within different Asian communities. It's not all Asian community. There's many different kinds of Asian communities, and including the Asian community that are born in Canada versus newer immigrants. And what do we do about it's called internalized racism, the questioner used, within the communities? Is there a way to deal with that so that people can come together?
So I'm not quite sure what the questioner meant by internalized racism, but let me try to answer that first part. So there are many people who, when people ask me like, "Hey, what's an Asian? How do you define what is an Asian?" I often kind of, in times when it's okay to joke, sort of say, it's the people formerly known as Orientals. In other words, it's not an eternal definition. Like, I'm not going around saying I'm Asian. You know, I'm many things. I was born here, I was this, as that. But it's not a category of self-identity generally. Now, you can learn that, in fact, for a long history, people who would be mistaken for each other, I use that term again, mistake, people with black hair look like they come from East Asia or South Asian, they can be mistaken for each other and treated and excluded and defined as not belonging here, no matter how. So there, after a while, you may say, you know, we're all Asian Canadian. We've actually suffered very similar forms of exclusion. And so it can create an identity category. You can start to come together around mutual exclusions, I would call it. But it's not one which is generally powerfully created internally. And that's why when people say, well, you know, shouldn't you naturally think alike since you're both Chinese? It's like, well, wait a minute, my family's background comes through this part of China, and this other person is through Hong Kong, and this other person has been here for 4 generations, and someone else like Ying just came 10 years ago and has a very particular kinds of experiences, and no, we don't share, just because we both have black hair, the same history and, you know, and language and culture and even food. You know, someone from the north part of China has very different food, comfort food, and ways of even living. We're rural versus urban. I raise this because often people think, well, one of the answers to racism is to point out the diversity of the people who are being lumped together. Like, we will combat anti-Chinese racism or anti-Asian racism by saying there's very many different kinds of Asians. So you're wrong, you're ignorant to lump them all together. I don't think it's a terrible thing to sort of say there are many different kinds of people who you're lumping together. It's the lumping together that's the problem, if that makes sense. You know, can you combat it by pointing out that when you beat up this person, you got the wrong Asian, you should have beat up that person? That's kind of wrong-headed response. So when you're asking me, how do we respond? One is, and here's where I think you know, when we internalize that, I should act differently. If I bring some food to lunch as a child and think people laugh at me, make fun of me, and say it's stinky, and I go, I'm never going to eat this home-cooked food again. I want to eat hot dogs and sandwiches. We often refer to that as internalized racism. In other words, how we are treated by others. We react, we could get angry, there's many different kinds of reactions, but one often is, yeah, that is inferior, exotic, and I don't want to do it anymore. I don't want to speak Chinese because people make fun of me. I don't want to speak Korean. I don't want to eat Korean food because people think it's smelly. When I bring curry that my mom lovingly made for me or my dad lovingly made for me for lunch and I go to school, people make fun of it. So I don't want to do that. If you mean by internalized racism, how can we deal with that? That has to deal with how do we, again, you know, strengthen our kids' ability to talk about that, to come home and let parents know how to discuss this because it's happening, right, at schools? How do we talk with parents? How are PACs at schools going to handle that kind of reaction? I think another way is when people, again, I talked about an investment in possessive belonging. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of goodies there for becoming Canadian. That's why people come from all around the world. They want to become Canadian, they want to become Canadian citizens. If we reinforce the divide of saying, yeah, if you are Canadian, then you shouldn't be scapegoated, you shouldn't be beat up. It's okay if you're a foreign student, though. If you're a permanent resident, okay, we'll extend some of those privileges of but really, we're going to denigrate, you know, all sets of people who aren't Canadian. Um, then I think we're going to have a problem. I'll put this concretely. At this moment, there's a lot of rising rhetoric about China, the fear of China, China and what it's doing, you know, as a rising global economic and political power. How that is being used and manipulated, you know, in order to, I think, often attack people who are Chinese or can presume to be Chinese, I think that is a particular moment that is unfortunately eerily reminiscent of 40, 50, 60 years ago during the height of anti-communism. And I think that is another aspect of how rhetorical anti-Chinese racism in terms of China and what's China doing as a government, how that gets conflated into a kind of very powerful history of anti-Asian racisms that are about not belonging, that you don't belong here, that it's a provisional belonging. You can be here 4 generations and you can become a Canadian citizen. You can argue that you shouldn't treat me differently anymore, but that is one of the things we do struggle with still in Canada, is the provisional belonging of non-whites, in particular, and that could, you know, that might mean if you come from the Caribbean and you're considered black, or from Africa, but also very viciously so in British Columbia, the idea that Asians don't belong no matter how long you've been here, but you can get off the airplane from Scotland, you belong as soon as you hit the soil because it's your soil. The term even native, notice how when we talk about native born, we imply that your birth here makes you a native, again, within the context of anti-Indigenous colonial practices that took land and resources away and, in some sense, took the idea that those who were native and we took things away, land and resources, and gave it to someone else. So I would put this in the context, in other words, of and maybe this is an answer to another question. What should we do in response to anti-Asian racism? To understand it in the context of broader exclusions, broader racisms, and to actually organize together, to come together around being against anti-Black racism, against the continuing and ongoing colonial, really occupation, you could say, of Indigenous lands and the use of their resources. To think about that, it's all tied together. And therefore, the sense of not belonging that is imputed to Asians, that's one form that we have to combat. And we need to, very much so right now, but if you're organizing, if you are yourself Chinese Canadian, as you're organizing, don't do it in isolation with that history of where we are, that we are on unceded Indigenous territory, that our success is still within a framework of the continuing exclusion, you could say, of Indigenous peoples from their own lands and resources.
Well, thank you, Dr. Yu. That's actually a good way for us to end, to remember how colonialism plays a part of the racist history of our country. I will thank all of our panelists and ask, there's one final question, and it is actually for MP Murray. So in addition to just answering this question briefly, MP Murray, I hope you'll be able to say a few final words. And the question is, what steps is the federal government taking to address anti-racism? anti-Asian racism?
Well, thanks for that. Thanks for that question. I really liked Dr. Yu's comment that we need to understand racism in the context of broader sets of racisms. And so one of the comments I would make is that the federal government is addressing racism by supporting other organizations that do that important work as opposed to directly. The most direct thing that we have done as a federal government is create a minister whose specific mandate is diversity, inclusion, and youth, and that's Minister Bardish Chagger. So that is our lens on everything that happens in cabinet and in Parliament, and the budget, for example. So having diversity and inclusion and youth as the key mandate for a minister means that there's a set of eyes on everything that goes through cabinet. Minister Chagger sits on the Treasury Board committee that I am the vice chair of Treasury Board. And so she sees every program that comes through Treasury Board, which is most programs that are stood up, and she has eyes on them from exactly that perspective. So I think that is the most powerful thing that we're doing right now. There is some funding in this recent budget to empower racialized Canadians, and it mentions specifically Asian Canadian communities, and that's proposing $11 million to do this work over the next couple of years. And there's also more money to what's called the Security Infrastructure Program, which initially was stood up for helping the Jewish community and the Muslim communities be able to increase security at their places of worship because of the targeting of mosques and houses of worship with violence, frankly. So this is seeing $2 million more in the budget, and it's broader now in terms of the communities that can utilize that. And then lastly, we've really focused on the Black community with a really substantial amount of funding in an endowment fund to fight back against anti-Black racism and to support Black Canadian communities and entrepreneurs. And I think what is the idea that the communities that experience racism share resources, ideas, and supports is a great one. And I think I'd love to see more of that. So thanks for that question. It's a key priority for our Prime Minister. He wouldn't have a minister attending to it through everything we do. I have just a note from one of my colleagues, Member of Parliament Jean Yip, who is a Toronto MP, and she sent me a note saying that she has a virtual vaccination town hall that she's doing soon. I don't have the date here, but it is being translated. The whole town hall will take place also in Cantonese and Mandarin. So for any of the Chinese Canadian participants in this town hall today, I'm going to ask my staff to put this up on our website. It's virtual vaccination town hall by MP Jean Yip. So that's something that you or others in your network are interested in knowing more about. And just to build confidence in all of our communities that vaccination is safe and appropriate. I'll make that available. And lastly, I just want to thank our speakers. So thank you, Dr. Yu, for your very informed and deeply knowledgeable perspective on this, and especially the thoughts around education. And Noah, thank you also very much. You're the voice of youth and social media. That was very interesting, your comments on that, as well as the anti-discrimination for the Jewish community and allies of those who are discriminated against. And Ying, for all of your continuing work to build community, bring people together and build friendships amongst the seniors and members of immigrant communities, and for all the great work you do in my office. So thanks all for joining us, and hope to see you at our next event. Thank you, Catherine, as always, for your very capable stewardship of these programs, and also to Neil in my office and Sabrina for tech support to keep things flowing and successful. So thanks all, and wish you a great rest of the weekend.